If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karenna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation.
Sometimes you've written a book and you're reading through it again and you think to yourself, oh my God, my book sucks. What can I do about this? But then the funny thing is that sometimes you read through your book and you're like, this is fantastic. I probably don't even need an editor. Everything's wonderful. And then you send it to an editor, or you don't, and you realize pretty quickly that actually maybe there were some major issues with your book. As a writing coach who also works as a copy editor and a line editor and a developmental editor, there are some things that I see time and time again that are common mistakes that writers, both newer writers and more experienced writers, top mistakes that they make in their book. And it's a shame that I see these mistakes over and over because, number one, it totally takes me forever to edit some of these books. But also, these are the sorts of mistakes that when you don't catch them, it really negatively impacts how your book is received, not only by readers, but frontline by reviewers, that's major, and also by your literary agent if you're trying to get conventionally published. I know that you might think that a literary agent is going to see through the awkward mistakes and see the quality of your story and get excited about it. But honestly, once there are a few too many issues, they don't have time to try to ignore those to see the gems that are buried in your book. So in this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, we're going to talk about the top mistakes that writers make in their books that they don't usually catch. I'm going to tell you how to identify those and easily correct those. And I've got some really good hacks for how to keep those mistakes from happening in the first place, or also how to fix them really, really quickly. So let's talk about some of these really common mistakes. Some of these are one of them really comes from the fact that you don't have distance from your manuscript. We're going to be talking more about that. You aren't reading it critically enough, obviously. Huge mistake is plot holes and quantum jumps. Some mistakes stem from the fact that writers are a little too worried about word count. I'll say how that impacts your work later. Your chapters and scenes aren't strong enough. Your characters are a bit lame. Your POV is a problem. Your dialogue is pretty bad. The pacing is way off. The momentum isn't there. Your setting has issues. You have a problem with the tone or other issues with your writing. Now, if you think that this is going to be a Debbie Downer of an episode that's super negative and that leaves you feeling bad, absolutely not, my friend. I've got you on this. We're going to figure out how to identify when we have an issue and how to fix it fast so that your book can shine and be the best that it can be. So thank you for joining me on the How to Be an Author podcast, and let's get going.
If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karenna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation.
Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I am writing coach Karenna Akavane, and when it comes to common mistakes in writing, believe me, I have seen it all as a writing coach and as an editor who helps authors to fix their books and make them as good as they can be. And believe me, these mistakes are really easy to make. If you think that I don't make any of these mistakes in my writing, as writers, we're always learning and growing. It is key to know that you don't need to be a natural at all of this stuff. This stuff comes with experience, and also we've got good days and bad days with our writing. We've got books that are more successful than others. This stuff is something that has its ups and downs, but we can just try to do our best. But let me talk first about things that happen when I see that newer writers, as they're navigating that craft of writing, they often make several common mistakes. So I'm going to hit on those first because these are things that I see all too much, all too often. And you can start thinking about whether this is an issue in your book. The first thing is a lack of structure. Newer writers in general, many of them struggle with organizing their ideas and structuring their stories effectively. And this is because many of us fall in love with an idea and we think, you know what, this is a great idea. I want to write a book. But when you're a newer writer, you're not necessarily thinking about storytelling. You're not thinking about plot development. You're not thinking about narrative arcs, and this is normal. You're a newbie to the whole storytelling structure of a novel concept. So it can really help you to try to do a little bit of research on what a good story structure is. And if you've already finished your book, go back and look and see if you have that. And this is where I have my little hack where I tell writers, okay, you've written your first draft. Now create an outline from your first draft. I want to see if your outline hits all those crucial story points. And if you're truly lost, you might want to use some kind of a structure like Save the Cat. This has a beat sheet which hits all of the crucial storytelling points, all of the different, little points that are crucial in a story, such as an inciting incident or various turning points. All of these moments that if you don't have them in your book, your reader's going to notice. If you are thinking about taking a course that's going to help you to figure out how to do this without making you feel dumb and without giving you a bunch of extra information that you don't need, you really want to check out my masterclass From Idea to Published in 6 months, because you will literally have the checklists and how-tos as to how to build a story with a really good structure. The next problem that many of the newer writers have is weak characterization. They're going to have a bunch of characters and often too many characters. This is a big problem. And so their characters don't become well-rounded or compelling. We don't learn things about them. They lack depth. They're not consistent. They're not relatable. And this makes it difficult for readers to connect with them. Now, it's fine that some of your characters are just these surface characters who show up, who are just basically window dressing. That's okay. But if we've got characters who either have a point of view or who are in lots of scenes, we want to know a little bit more about them. Another thing that newer writers do a lot is that they rely heavily on excessive adjectives and adverbs and also kind of overdone vocabulary. They think that, sophisticated vocabulary is going to make them sound smarter, but actually it feels overwritten and it dilutes the impact of your writing. If you can have super simple writing that doesn't go that much above a 10th grade level and tell your story in a way that's reachable for more readers, I think that it's going to serve you more in the long run. Another issue that newer writers have is they fall into the trap of telling rather than showing. Showing is stuff that's shown through actions, dialogue, sensory details. If you're telling too much, the writing feels passive and less engaging, and it really messes with your pacing. Now, believe me, there are times when telling is necessary. If you're showing absolutely every little detail, it's going to bog down the story, but establishing a good balance of showing and telling is going to be something that probably takes a little bit of experience to figure out, but just be aware of it. Now, POVs, shifts in perspective. Many newer writers get really excited about getting into the head of multiple characters. There is a lot of head hopping or head jumping, as we call it, and you are shifting between too many perspectives and you are confusing your reader and you're disrupting the immersion of the reader into the story. So maintaining a consistent and well-executed point of view, it's a challenge, but it's an important thing to get right. Another thing that many new writers don't get is that there's a lack of massive conflict or tension. Not only do you need to introduce conflict and tension, but you need to sustain it. Without this, your narrative is going to be lacking in suspense and it's not going to move along. And as a newer writer, many writers I see want to have things feel fun and positive and light. And that's great, but you can't have that all the time because your tension's going to evaporate. So that's really, really important. And another thing that I see, and this is really, it's kind of a cute thing, but many of my writers who are younger and who are maybe in college or in high school or just out of it, they are going to introduce some humor into their work and it doesn't work. They're going to try to introduce, some eye rolling or some fun asides, some sarcasm, things like that. And it's so hard to get that right in your work. And so I really work hard with these writers to try to match their tone with their genre and their themes, and to convince them that sometimes keep your sense of humor for when you're actually chatting with your friends and not in your book. Inserting humor into a book is more situational and less, slapstick. And so that's an important thing to say as well. And also, newer writers, there's a huge thing, which is this impatience. And they'll be saying, okay, well, I worked so hard on it. It's been a long time. I need to get it out. And they don't want to revise their book that much because they don't want to waste time. They don't want to throw out anything they wrote. They feel like, I worked so hard on this. I'm not going to scrap it. Well, sometimes that's exactly what your book needs, is a little bit of scrapping. And it's not time wasted. It's time where you are completely, polishing your work. And that's really, really important. So it might feel like it's really hard for you to, step away from your book and to see these things yourself. And it can be. We're going to be talking more about how you can do that. But let me talk about a couple more little things that I see sometimes in some of the work. I'll see things where, for example, we're not scene setting enough. And basically, your character's in a scene and I totally don't understand what the space looks like, what it feels like, who's in the room, or the setting's going to be kind of inconsistent where your character's in this room 1 minute and the next minute they're walking in the woods. And I'm like, how did they get there? And also the description of the woods is done in kind of a weird way where I'm like, I can't even see how this would be possible. That's really, really important, right? When you're shifting your character from place to place and you haven't done the right scene setting or research, or you haven't visualized it in your head to see, okay, is it possible for them to be sitting like I'm describing them sitting? And how do they get up from that position? Sometimes these things are important, right? So I think I'm going to give you a little trick for how you can just write these things correctly in the first place. That's really, really important. The inconsistent point of view, super important too, because too many times what we do is we make the mistake where we're going to jump from point of view to point of view, and then there's going to be a character who knows something that they couldn't possibly know. So this is something to really be looking out for when you have a limited point of view. Some characters don't know certain things, and that actually adds to the suspense and that adds to the tension. So that's really, really important. Now, too many times in the dialogue, you're going to have dialogue that totally does not advance the plot. It doesn't reveal character. It's overly expository. And so half the time I'll tell my writers, listen, this dialogue, I really feel like you can probably lose over half of it and it's going to be better in the long run. I think that it's important to read your dialogue aloud, yes, but so many times you guys read it aloud and you don't actually look to see what's going on. You don't listen to yourself. You're reading it aloud, going through the motions, but it's kind of funny because it doesn't actually fix the issue. So we're going to be talking about some little hints on how you can do that as well. And also in terms of your story structure, I want you to look at how it is, because many times some of you are going to freak out about the word count. And so you start off in super detail, being a little repetitive, too much, heavy description because you think that you need to, kind of pad this thing like a college essay. And really, you didn't need to. So by the end, you're actually hurrying through because you're like, oh, now I have 150,000 words all of a sudden. That's not awesome, right? So that's really important. And also one of the big things that I see in especially newer writers' work is I'll see these characters who are not acting decisively. I'm seeing a weak character with not much main character energy, and they're overly relying on their friends to carry them through. I'll see these stories where there's an inciting incident, but all of a sudden the main character is kind of wandering through, getting all these bad ideas and, taking polls on what they should be doing and kind of spending a lot of time debating on what they should be doing, when that just makes it kind of weak. So hesitation as to what you should do, that's a realistic thing. However, I want your character to be more decisive than that and not be relying on too many characters. Finally, the weak opening where the book starts slower, but then it gets good, No, we cannot have that. And you know what? You might quote to me a gazillion books where you think that that's the case, but actually just because a book starts calmly doesn't mean it's starting slowly. Sometimes a book starts with not much action or anything else, but we're really getting to know the characters. We're really diving into their world. We're getting an idea of the tone, things like that. So it's not actually starting slowly, it's starting deep. And that's really different. So let's think about that for a minute. So now let me talk about how you can actually evaluate your book in different ways, because, self-evaluation is not easy. So the first thing that you need to do is really you should take a break. Step away from the manuscript for a little bit, get some fresh perspective, and taking a break can really help identify ideas that need improvement. And it can highlight the issues that you might have overlooked. So that's really, really important. And also reading your manuscript aloud or having someone else do it, ouch, that can help you to identify like awkward sentence structure, repetitive phrases, dialogue that doesn't flow. That really helps. And this is also why I recommend, last week's episode was all about dictation and transcription. This is why that stuff works really well up front, because it helps you to figure out the flow and to create something that flows already. Now, another thing that you can do is streamline your manuscript. Look for unnecessary scenes. Look for unnecessary words. Look for repetition. Look for unnecessary phrases. Sometimes some of you are in love with a phrase because you think it's super poetic, but actually it takes away from the pacing and it takes away from the clarity. So really, write some poetry to get that out of your system, and then think about, how can I make this as clear and as straightforward as possible? Yes, I can make my language beautiful, but I want to focus on keeping the storytelling strong. And you also want to pay particular attention to the opening lines and the conclusion of each scene. These should be pretty captivating, and you should have a feeling at the beginning that something's going to happen. And at the end, you should know that something has happened to change what's going on and to move the story forward. If that hasn't happened, your ending of each scene is not strong enough. Now, you're going to want to evaluate passages for balance in actions, dialogue, description. How can you make the storytelling more immersive, right? And sometimes this is something that you can't figure out yourself, so you're going to want to seek some feedback from beta readers, from friends, from critique partners. They're definitely going to identify areas for improvement, but a little caveat for that. Oftentimes, a beta reader is going to know what's not working. They're not going to know how to fix it. That's up to you as the writer to polish that up. Definitely when you're editing, you want to approach it with specific goals in mind. So some of these specific goals are like, let's strengthen character development. Let's improve our pacing. Let's enhance our descriptions. Focusing on these different aspects at different times can make your editing process more effective and efficient. So when we're dealing with your characters, for example, I want to make sure that each important character has a unique backstory. I want them to have flaws and vulnerabilities. If they don't have one, go back and give them some. I want them to have strong motivations, often conflicting. I want them to have complex relationships, but not too many of them, unique quirks and habits. And I want us to have these strong goals and obstacles for them, complexity, and I want them to change throughout the book. So many times I mentioned that too many young writers have too many characters and their characters have too many darn friends. And this is such a huge issue, and it cracks me up because it's so common. If you do this, you're not the only one. You want your character to be popular. You don't want them to be lonely. But when a character has too many friends, it can be really challenging to give enough depth and development to each relationship. So the relationships become pretty superficial and underexplored. So readers don't connect with and invest in those connections. And that means that it takes away from your character as well. Also, it can be unrealistic because depending on the context and the setting of your story, having a shit ton of friends can be unrealistic. It kind of creates this idealized or idealistic social dynamic that might not resonate with your readers who are accustomed to kind of in their life to these nuanced and varied relationships and not quantity over quality. And really, it takes away from the narrative focus. It becomes very diluted. We start to wonder, what am I supposed to be paying attention to? What's meaningful here? And that's not great. It kind of, having this abundance of friends, it results in a lack of super strong conflict between, the character and their other relationships. And conflict is such a driving force when it comes to storytelling. Without it, the narrative doesn't feel that engaging. It doesn't feel that deep. And when characters rely on their friends, this is what I was talking about with like the main character energy, when they're relying on their friends as a support, like a source of support and validation. Yeah, that happens in real life. Absolutely. But you know what happens too? It limits their personal growth and it inhibits their ability to face challenges independently. That means a less compelling character arc. Codependency does not make an awesome story unless your character moves away from it. Right? So I'm not saying your character can have no friends, but I'm just saying strike a good balance. Really important. So that's super, super important. The other thing, I'm trying to go through things here that are like, major problems and going into them in more depth. Okay, dialogue is also a huge issue. And I have a whole podcast episode about dialogue that you might want to listen to. But here's some quick tips to help you to improve it. So you definitely want it to sound natural. However, you want to avoid, even though you're avoiding this stilted language and this and that, you don't want to have too much slang and you don't want to have too much empty dialogue because, though we often chit chat with our friends, this doesn't move your story forward. So that's really important. And also in your dialogue, you want to show, don't tell. You want to show character traits, emotions, and relationships, but you don't have to explicitly state these things. You can use their words, their tone, and their body language and whatever they're doing while they're speaking. Because this is an important thing. When people are talking, I hate it when I see characters just standing around in a circle and having this group discussion. It drives me absolutely nuts. I'd rather see your characters doing something useful because this also chops up your dialogue so that we don't have long utterances. I want to see a lot of subtext, right? So it's kind of important like what characters don't say, just as important as what they do say. And don't have them answering every question in detail, right? And make sure that you're varying speech patterns and style, but I don't want it to be so full of colloquialisms that we don't understand what's going on. And it's a little hard to understand. That's not awesome. And I don't want you to have these dialogue tags that are super repetitive or weird or super specific. I want you to be super clear about who's talking and how, but I don't want you to be relying too much on repetitive tags. Like use the action beats or the context to attribute the dialogue so that you don't always have to tell us who's speaking if it's kind of obvious. And also take out any filler and any exposition. Reading the dialogue aloud, of course, that's a great thing to do, but you need to really listen to yourself reading it aloud. And that's why listening to someone else might actually help. Now, when we're looking at the description in your setting, this is another setting problem and a big common issue in a lot of work is that there's that lack of vivid description. Like I said, we don't get immersed in the story because we have a few little hints as to where we are and what it's about, but it's not enough. Or you can have too much. Sometimes people describe everything in absolute detail and we're like, why do I need this? I'm overwhelmed. The pacing's been slowed down and I really don't need to know the shape of the window unless my character is about to step out of it. I don't need to know the exact paint color unless my character chose it with their late mother, so that's really, really crucial. And then we've got this world building that's just too complex, but then it's not, consistent because it's so confusing. And, writers will say, I'm a world builder, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, that I can tell because you've spent, 50,000 words with your world building, but actually none of this was crucial to the story. That's really interesting. So I don't want the world to be generic at all. I want it to be unique and memorable. But each of these features that set it apart from the others, each of these distinct landmarks in your story, this tells us something more about the story, about your character's experience, about the culture, all of that stuff. It's supposed to really add to it. You're using your setting as a character. If you fail to do that, you're losing an opportunity. Right? The setting absolutely must impact the story. And also make sure you're not relying on stereotypes. If your character is in Paris, If you mentioned the Eiffel Tower one too many times, that's going to be really boring. And also, if you researched your location wrong and you have these misrepresentations, that's fair if you're making something up, and it's fair if it really feeds your story, but it could annoy some readers. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So just as a little wrap up here, when you are looking at your book, know that there are some common mistakes that we all make, especially when we're just starting out, and that in self-editing, you can think that you're self-editing appropriately and you're wasting your time. I think that it is possible to really take it apart and start focusing on different aspects so that you can troubleshoot in a more focused way, but there's absolutely no substitute for using a real editor, or at the very least, some very perspicacious beta readers who are actually going to look at different aspects of your book. This is really so important. But I hope that this helps to look at, your book and to take the drama out of the editing process and the self-editing process, to stop worrying about your book being uniquely sucky. It's not. It probably enters into a whole category of similar sucky books, but you can absolutely fix this, and you can fix it more easily than you thought. That's it this week. I hope this helped. If you are a writing coach on demand person, you get to go on to your bonus materials, of which there are some very useful ones that are going to help you with your self-editing step by step. And also, if you think that you want to start writing a book without wasting time making the mistakes that are so common, you definitely want to check out my masterclass From Idea to Published in 6 months. It's going to walk you through how to write a book that doesn't have any of those rookie mistakes in it. Thank you so much for being with me, and I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast.
If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.